Hey there, Dylan Fraser here. I'm a local realtor in Guelph alongside David Pipe, a local mortgage agent also based in Guelph. And you are here because you're thinking about the prospect of buying a Century home in Guelph. Um, and I'm sure you've heard that Century homes come with their own challenges. Sometimes you might have even heard of someone who bought a Century home and it just ended up being a money pit. And that's what you're trying to avoid. Um, Ultimately, you've worked hard for your money, and you know that there's challenges that come with it. So we're going to speak to some of those challenges, what you can do ahead of time to avoid those challenges, as well as what to look for as you go through the process, so that you don't get into any of those tight situations, so that you ultimately have a plan from where you are now to get you into your dream Century home that you can love for years to come.
Perfect, Dylan. And the truth is that when it comes down to the way I look at it as on the mortgage side, it's all about being prepared. So, the best way to be successful with a purchase like this is to think ahead and be prepared. So, first and foremost, some advice for people who are out there looking to buy Century homes or looking to get into that market is start with a pre-approval. It may seem simple, but the pre-approval is really your way to understand that the budget works, the numbers work, and there's no surprises with the way that either your income is calculated or the way that they might approve the mortgage based on the way the rates are today. So, is first and foremost, start with a pre-approval. It will hold your rate for up to 120 days. It will give you some peace of mind and give you that confidence to get out there and start shopping, even though you may have the urge to start shopping first. Speaking along the lines of a pre-approval, the one thing that might be able to help you, or you might want to talk about earlier in the process, is the idea of supplemental or accessory income. So it's not for everybody, but in a lot of these homes, there may be a secondary apartment or a secondary suite that is, suitable for renting to another person. And in today's rent market, rent can contribute a lot of income to the situation and can actually help you to improve or raise up the amount you might be able to borrow based on this new income that you could use. Whether or not you have a tenant signed up, of course, is not necessarily important this early in the game. But if you're open to the idea, understanding the potential for that kind of income and whether or not it works for you will help you to potentially maximize your approval, and B, rule out or rule in certain kinds of properties that will help to narrow that search with your realtor. So consider that as well as another thing. And finally, the other reason to be prepared is timing is key. We may not know exactly when the perfect house comes along. It may go on the market tomorrow. And so if you're thinking about that process and really thinking about getting out there and considering a unique property like this, the right one for you may not come along for months, but when it does, it always feels better to be ready. So start ahead and have your sort of ducks in a row, so to speak, so that when the time comes, you're prepared to make that move if it's the right move for you. Dylan, what else do they need to know about the area?
Well, speaking about what you were saying about ruling properties in and ruling them out, knowing the neighborhood right off the bat. So when it comes to Guelph's Century homes, they tend to be closer to downtown. The borders of the city used to be a lot smaller than they are now. There are the odd country home or old country home that's now in the city outside of the downtown area. But getting an appreciation for what those neighborhoods in the core downtown look like. Getting an appreciation for even just street to street, because it's so close to the downtown core. Just being one street over can make a massive difference in the feel of the neighborhood. And so, if you can get an appreciation for that up front, you'll be able to, again, rule in and rule out some properties before they even come on the market. And then you can also identify some sort of problem areas. Part of that is, again, just using your gut for how you feel in certain streets and neighborhoods, but also getting some education ahead of time as to some potential hiccups or challenges that we'll talk about a little bit later on that are pertinent to different neighborhoods. And then once you have that narrowed in to a couple streets, or you might even have a list of houses that, oh my goodness, if that one came up, I'd jump all over it. And you might be able to even reach out directly to that homeowner to see if they're thinking about selling, um, because there might be someone else who also has their eye on it.
It's a great point, when you think about the fact that these kind of homes are so unique in nature that it could literally be a specific house that you're looking for. And so, taking all those steps might be able to help you get there. When it comes to the financing side, now that you're thinking about, you found a property, you've fallen in love with it, it's time to start getting serious about making sure the numbers work. A couple things that are important, or tips that are really valuable for somebody in that stage. Of course, expect an appraisal. So it's very common, especially with older homes, to see that the lender or the bank that you're working with is going to want to do an appraisal, which is basically just an evaluation of the value of the property. So it's meant to make sure that the price you're paying for that home matches up with the reasonable market value for that property. And it's important because unique homes of this nature, you might have fallen in love with and been prepared to pay a little bit more than you might have for a similar home somewhere else. So make sure that you sort of temper that expectation with your realtor. Make sure you understand what the comparable market looks like, so that the value you pay for the price, sorry, the value you pay for the property matches up with what's reasonable in the market. The other thing to know is that while that appraiser is not meant to go in and assess the property's condition or functionality, sometimes they do note situations on the appraisal report which could cause a problem if not sort of prepared for in advance. So a couple things that are sort of critical that might come up, and it really comes down to whether or not the property can be insured. So what insurance there is our second point, but an insurance company like your home insurance company that will provide you with fire insurance needs to make sure that the electrical is functional and meets the basic standards, and that the heating system is functional. So it may feel like a property is your perfect dream property because the decor, the design, the layout, the finishes, even things like the roof are exactly what you had expected. And you might think that, either wiring or, the furnace is an afterthought, but be really aware of how the lender might look at it. In their mind, you can always change decor, you can always renovate, but you may not be able to close your purchase on the day you expect if the property can't be insured. So those are really the two common issues from a financing perspective. And a lot of the rest of it is, more considered, cosmetic in their mind. So keep your mortgage agent, your mortgage broker, as well as your realtor engaged throughout the process, so that we can help you to sort of head off those issues as they may come along. And that will help you to make the most of the financing and make sure the financing process is sort of as comfortable and easy as possible for you. But there might be more issues, Dylan. What else should they know about?
Yeah, so some of the other issues, and building off of not only the lender side, which can affect you actually getting a mortgage, but also some of the things that you might just not want to have to pay a fortune to remedy. Of course, there's things like on the wiring. 100 years ago, they didn't use copper wiring. They used, or the same style of copper wiring rather. They used knob and tube wiring, which lenders don't like. But also over the course of 100 years, you can get a lot of different homeowners doing renovations, which can just lend itself to a mess of wiring, which you might not want to get yourself into, or you might want to be aware that you're getting yourself into. As well as during those renovations, they can be done in different levels of quality over time. So being very cognizant of where additions have been made, and if any corners have been cut for those from a structural standpoint, as well as from what can be gleaned in the mechanical aspect as well. And then insulation is a big one, because 100 years ago, the go-to material in insulation was asbestos. So whether that's vermiculite insulation or asbestos wraps on piping was very popular back in the day. There's telltale signs that can point to that, that you can be aware of and look for during the process. And then from an outside of the home standpoint, but still on the property, it can be you need to pay even more attention than on some of these newer homes, because property standards and planning wasn't as developed 100 years ago as it is now. So even though it might look like houses are uniform, if you were to sort of lay down the property lines in real life, they might look like this, whereas the house looks like this. So your shed or garage might actually be in your neighbor's yard. And your parking, while it might look like that's your driveway, it might actually be your neighbor's. And it can, if you don't have a legal right of way to that parking space, then that can affect value massively, as well as just your enjoyment of your home.
Yeah, that's really important, and you don't think about it, right? But often these issues come up when ownership changes. Maybe the people who lived there before knew about it or didn't know about it, but it didn't matter. So yeah, that's a really good point, Dylan. And this gets down to the sort of the nitty gritty of the process. So from a mortgage perspective, here's what the overall process looks like. Of course, there's many more steps, but things you should think about as far as the big picture. So number one, again, just to reiterate, pre-approval, do it first. It's not complicated. It helps to understand whether or not the numbers make sense for you and for the bank overall. It doesn't provide a guarantee and it doesn't commit you, so you can change lenders after the fact. You can do whatever you want, but it really gives you a sense of that you're headed in the right direction. Of course, then you get out there and the fun stuff. You start looking for a property, you find the one you love, your realtor, and you go through all the issues together, like what Dylan mentioned earlier, and then you get to that accepted offer. From there, that's when the pedal hits the metal, I guess. When it comes to the mortgage process itself, we submit that, we get a commitment. The commitment letter is essentially your offer, your contract with the lender or the bank to provide that mortgage, and it includes all the important terms and conditions. So the rate is one thing, but there's so many other things that are part of that. So once the commitment is signed and you're satisfied with that, then really you just get into gathering documentation, which leads towards a lawyer meeting. So you'll meet with your lawyer, whoever you've chosen to handle that transaction for you. Usually a couple of weeks ahead of time, but it can vary depending on their schedule and yours. You sign some final documents there. That's when you'll have to deliver your down payment and provide a check for their services. And then after that point, it's just basically a waiting until the closing day. So it could be, like I said, 1 to 2 weeks, and then you'll receive your keys or your lockbox code on the big day. So the good news is that we try and get a lot of this stuff done earlier in the process, so that you avoid all surprises much earlier. So if an appraisal is requested, it'll happen somewhere after commitment or hopefully right around there. So just one more piece of that pie. But that's sort of overall what the process looks like. Dylan, what else do they need to know if they're sort of thinking more about getting into this?
Yeah, so at that, when we're talking about going through the process, it's important to sort of assemble a team for yourself. And if that team has local knowledge, then you're just going to be in such a better position to be able to stay on top of the unique issues that buying a Century home brings. So from the standpoint of a mortgage broker and a realtor, of course, but an inspector who knows the particular issues that are sort of historical for homes in the area can be massively helpful. Heck, they might have even already been in the house that you are looking at. And they can speak to some of those historical issues. And then, as we've been talking about this entire mortgage process, an appraisal is a big deal, especially for Century home. And when one street's value can be massively different from another because of just the prestige of it, an appraiser who's not local and is just looking at everything from a map isn't going to appreciate those differences, whereas an appraiser can sort of fight for your behalf when it comes to talking back to the lender who's ultimately just looking at numbers on a spreadsheet. And then because a local team tends to bump into one another more often and work together, they ultimately just work more cohesively because they have rapport with one another.
Yeah, it's true, Dylan. And the local approach is probably something that a lot of people might overlook. You know, there's a reason why somebody might have a unique knowledge of that area, especially when it comes to homes like this. They're not, built yesterday. They're not all the same. So that's really critical. And I'll tell you a story after. But before I do, of course, we hope this video was valuable for you. Next steps, if you're thinking about getting more into this or you want to learn more. So connect with either Dylan or myself. Connect with somebody local to you if you're not local here. But understand, that we love to talk about these things and start the process early, as I mentioned in this last point. Don't wait until you're, already decided on a property before you, start, interviewing and talking with people that might be able to help you to build up your team. So either connect with us, either set up a call, book a meeting, whatever makes sense for you. Even just get the lines of communication open. And like I said before, start early. Coming from the perspective of the mortgage, you can see that that preparation is super important. But back to that story that when you mentioned that, Dylan. So one thing I'll say to everybody while they're watching is I had a very similar situation that might shed some light. I had a client who purchased, two clients actually. They purchased a property. It had been built a long time ago. Had water access, so it wasn't in Guelph directly, but this property bordered on a small river basically, and so the property value looked great. Everything looked really good. The purchase was good. They sent out the appraiser, and the appraiser did their report and came back with, yeah, valuation's good, but we noticed that they don't actually have control over the water's edge. So there's what they call an easement, which is like a right of way or a spot that you as the homeowner don't have control over. And of course, that right of way access, that easement, is really important for a lender who's providing financing on a property that's on water, because that's going to be critical for them from an enjoyment perspective. So what they did was that caused an issue with the mortgage, and the lender came back and said, hey, we're not happy. We have to understand this better. And the point of the story is that only through connecting with in this case, it was the realtor, so somebody local who understood, they were able to shed some light on it. And in this case, what had happened was this property was, probably over 100 years old. And believe it or not, the river that they border on was actually used as a logging road, like to move logs up and down the river way back, probably more than 100 years ago. And so an easement had been set up by the government to facilitate, smooth and easy flow of those logs up and down the river, so that the loggers didn't have to, worry about if they stopped on someone's property getting into trouble. So this easement was never changed and never removed, and everybody on the river's edge has it on their property. But the lender doesn't know that because, as you had mentioned, Dylan, they're looking at a spreadsheet. They're looking at this from an office maybe in Toronto or some other big city. And so without that knowledge, without that local information, and without that planning, it might have caused a major problem for the mortgage if we weren't able to get that information. So, the point of the story is that, sometimes these little things become big things if you're not prepared. So hopefully this video is valuable. And if you have questions, we're here to help. Please reach out anytime. Thanks very much.